The apartment next door had been vacant for months, so when I saw the moving truck outside, I was relieved. Empty units in Los Santos often attracted squatters or worse. I peered through my peephole as a pretty woman stepped into the hallway, her movements confident yet slow. She must have been in her late 30s or early 40s, with curly gray hair pinned up neatly and a flowing floral dress that swayed as she walked. She exuded an air of elegance that felt out of place in our run-down building on Elgin Avenue. "Good afternoon," she called, her voice warm and inviting. "I'm Rosa, just moved in next door." I opened my door slightly, offering a polite smile. "Welcome to the building," I said. "Thank you, dear. It's lovely to meet a friendly face." She tilted her head, studying me. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" "I don't think so," I replied, chuckling nervously. "Well, I'm sure we'll get to know each other soon enough," she said with a wink. Over the next few weeks, Rosa made herself known in the building. She had a knack for appearing at just the right moment. When I was coming home from work, heading out to run errands, or even tossing my trash, she'd always stop to chat, her words laced with a strange intimacy that made me uneasy. "You remind me of someone I loved very much," she said one evening as we stood in the hallway. "Who's that?" I asked, trying to sound polite. "My late husband," she said, her eyes glistening. "You have the same eyes, the same energy." Her tone was strange, but I didn't want to offend her. I laughed it off awkwardly and changed the subject. Over time, my unease with Rosa began to fade. Maybe it was her warmth, her way of making me feel seen in a city where everyone else seemed to ignore each other. We began spending more time together, coffee at her place, dinners that she insisted on cooking. Her apartment was a shrine to her past life. Photos of her late husband covered the walls, and her stories about him painted a picture of a man who was deeply loved. "He was my soulmate," she would say, her voice tinged with sorrow. "I never thought I'd feel that way about anyone again, until you." Her confession caught me off guard, but it also stirred something inside me. She was older, yes, but there was a vitality about her, a wisdom that drew me in. Our friendship deepened, and one night, it happened. We were sitting on her couch, the glow of candlelight flickering between us. She reached out, her fingers brushing against mine. "You don't have to be alone," she whispered. Neither of us spoke after that. The moment pulled us together and we kissed. It felt strange but also exhilarating, like I was stepping into a story that wasn't my own. That night, we made love, and it was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Her touch was both tender and consuming, her fingers tracing patterns on my skin that sent shivers through me, as if she were unlocking parts of my soul I hadn't known were there. When it was over, I lay beside her, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The next morning, I woke up alone. Rosa was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The scent of something sweet wafted through the air, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. "Good morning," she said, placing a plate of pancakes in front of me. Her smile was radiant, but her eyes, there was something off about them. As the days passed, I began to notice other changes. Rosa became more possessive, insisting that I spend more time with her. When I hesitated, she would remind me of the connection we shared, how we were meant to be together. "You don't understand," she said one night, her voice trembling with desperation. "You're not just anyone to me. You're the key." "The key to what?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. "To bringing him back," she replied, her eyes filling with tears. At first I thought she was being metaphorical, but her behavior grew stranger. She started lighting candles around her apartment, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. She'd stare at me for long stretches, her lips moving silently, as though she were praying. One night I woke to find her standing at the foot of my bed. The soft glow of her candle cast eerie shadows on her face. "Rosa, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. She smiled, her expression almost serene. "He's almost here," she said. "You've brought him closer than I ever could alone." I sat up, my heart racing. "What are you talking about? Who's coming?" "My husband," she whispered. "He's chosen you as the vessel. He'll live again, through you." I froze, her words sinking in like a weight, dragging me under. "This is insane, Rosa. You need help." She tilted her head, her smile fading. "I don't need help. I need you to trust me." I avoided her for the next few days, but she wasn't easily deterred. She'd knock on my door at all hours, slipping notes under the frame when I didn't answer. Each note contained the same message: "It's already begun." The final straw came one night when I returned home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. I pushed it open cautiously, my breath catching at the sight of Rosa sitting in the middle of my living room. Candles surrounded her in a perfect circle, their flames flickering ominously. She was holding a small knife, the blade glinting in the candlelight. "This is for us," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Once the ritual is complete, we'll be together forever." I backed away slowly, my mind racing. "Rosa, you don't have to do this. We can talk." "It's too late for that," she interrupted. She lunged toward me, and I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and swung it at her. She crumpled to the floor, the knife clattering out of her hand. I called the police, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. When they arrived, Rosa was still unconscious. They took her into custody, and I later learned she had a history of mental illness, including delusions about her late husband. I moved out of the building shortly after, unable to stay in the place where everything had happened. Rosa was committed to a psychiatric facility, but her words still haunt me. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I was part of something bigger, something I'll never fully understand. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of her humming, carried on the wind like a ghostly reminder of the love that almost consumed me.
It all started like any other relationship, a chance encounter at a coffee shop on Eclipse Boulevard. I had gone there to escape the chaos of Los Santos traffic, seeking solace in a warm cup of coffee and the sound of muffled chatter. He had approached me with a friendly smile and an effortless charm. He seemed different, quiet, grounded, someone who stood apart from the usual chaos of the city. For months, everything felt perfect. He was attentive, thoughtful, and always had a way of making me laugh, even after the toughest days. We'd spend evenings at his apartment on Clinton Avenue, cooking dinner together and sharing stories. He claimed he was a private chef, working for high-end clients. His apartment was small but immaculate. Every utensil had its place, and the fridge was always stocked with exotic ingredients I couldn't pronounce. He loved to cook for me, always insisting I try his latest culinary experiment. One night, he made a stew that smelled like nothing I'd ever encountered before, rich, earthy, and strangely sweet. I took a bite, and it was incredible. But when I asked him what kind of meat he'd used, he hesitated. "It's a secret," he said with a playful grin. I laughed it off, assuming he was trying to be mysterious. But something about the way he avoided my gaze stayed with me. As time passed, little things began to bother me. He was cagey about his past, deflecting questions with jokes or changing the subject. He never let me look in certain cabinets in his kitchen, claiming they were too messy. One day, curiosity got the better of me. While he was out running errands, I decided to peek inside his forbidden cabinets. What I found chilled me to the core. Glass jars lined the shelves, each filled with odd preserved objects floating in murky liquid. Some were clearly herbs or spices, but others were harder to identify. One jar held what looked like a severed finger, the skin wrinkled and gray. Another contained something that resembled an eyeball, suspended in viscous fluid. I slammed the cabinet shut, my hands trembling. I told myself it had to be a joke, some twisted collection meant to shock guests. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I couldn't eat the dinner he prepared. Every bite turned to ash in my mouth as I replayed the image of those jars. He noticed my unease and pressed me about it, his tone soft but insistent. "Is something wrong?" he asked, tilting his head in that charming way he always did. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "Just a headache," I lied. But I couldn't hide my fear for long. A few days later, I found an envelope tucked under a stack of papers on his desk. Inside were Polaroid photos, pictures of dismembered body parts, laid out like a grotesque still life. My stomach churned as I flipped through them, each image worse than the last. I wanted to leave right then, but my instincts told me to act normal. If he suspected I knew, who knows what he'd do? That evening, he suggested we go for a drive. He claimed he wanted to show me a special spot outside the city. My pulse raced as I tried to think of an excuse, but his smile froze me in place. We drove for what felt like hours, leaving the lights of Los Santos behind. The winding roads of Banham Canyon stretched endlessly, the darkness swallowing the car's headlights. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You'll see," he replied, his tone unnervingly calm. Finally, he pulled off onto a dirt road, stopping in front of a small cabin. It was isolated, surrounded by dense woods. He led me inside, flipping on a single dim light. The smell hit me first, metallic and foul, like something rotting. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw what the cabin held. Hooks hung from the ceiling, some still dripping with blood. A large table in the center was stained dark red, and on it lay tools, knives, saws, and other instruments I didn't want to identify. I turned to him, my breath caught in my throat. "I wanted to share this with you," he said, his voice almost tender. "You're special to me, and I think you'll understand." He stepped closer, holding a knife in his hand. I stumbled backward, my mind racing for a way out. "I don't want this," I shouted, my voice cracking. He frowned as if I'd disappointed him. "You will," he said. "You just need time." Before he could get any closer, I grabbed a heavy glass jar from a nearby shelf and smashed it against his head. He staggered, dropping the knife, and I bolted for the door. The forest was pitch black, but I didn't care. I ran, branches slashing at my face and arms, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I saw headlights in the distance. A passing car screeched to a halt as I stumbled onto the road, waving my arms frantically. The driver, a middle-aged man, took one look at me and called the police. They found him in the cabin, unconscious from the blow to his head. The evidence inside was enough to convict him of multiple murders. The police later told me he had been killing for years, luring women in with his charm and using their bodies for his art. They never confirmed it, but I'm almost certain some of his meals had been people. Even now, the thought makes me nauseous. I've moved to a different part of Los Santos, far from Clinton Avenue, and I've tried to rebuild my life, but every time I step into a kitchen or see a Polaroid camera, I can't help but think of him and how close I came to becoming his next masterpiece.
The night had a strange feel to it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I had stayed late at work, and was walking home through the winding streets of Los Santos, sticking to the busier areas for safety. The city never truly slept, and even at 11 p.m., the streets buzzed with life. Bars spilling over with rowdy laughter, the faint hum of music, and the occasional roar of a car engine. I thought I was being careful. I stayed on Vinewood Boulevard, walking past the flashing neon signs of bars and restaurants. But as I turned onto Dorset Drive, a quieter stretch leading toward my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the stillness, and for a moment I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the empty street behind me, the faint flicker of a street lamp the only movement. I kept walking, my pace quickening. My apartment was only a few blocks away, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Then I heard it. A second set of footsteps. They were faint at first, but unmistakable. My heart sped up as I tried to convince myself it was just someone heading in the same direction. I stole another glance behind me and saw two men, their faces shadowed under baseball caps, walking several paces back. I turned my gaze forward, forcing myself to stay calm. They're just walking, I told myself. They're probably not even paying attention to me. But as I passed a small convenience store on the corner of Portola Drive, I saw them in the store window's reflection. They had picked up their pace. My stomach tightened. I made a split-second decision to duck into the store. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I pretended to browse the shelves. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw them stop outside the store, exchanging words I couldn't hear. "What are you looking for?" the cashier asked, breaking the silence. "Just snacks," I mumbled, grabbing a random bag of chips. When I finally mustered the courage to look toward the entrance, the men were gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I stepped out of the store, they emerged from the shadows of the alleyway beside it, their eyes locking onto mine. My pulse quickened, and I decided to run. The bag of chips fell from my hand as I sprinted down the street, my apartment building in sight. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps pounding the pavement. I turned the corner onto Spanish Avenue, my breath ragged. I fumbled for my keys, praying I wouldn't drop them. When I reached the entrance to my building, I slammed the key into the lock when pushed the door open, slamming it shut behind me. Through the glass door, I saw them standing on the sidewalk, their faces now visible. One of them had a scar running down his cheek, and the other wore a crooked grin that made my skin crawl. I hurried up the stairs to my apartment, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I dialed the non-emergency police line, explaining what had happened. The operator assured me they would send a patrol car to the area, but there wasn't much they could do unless the men had committed a crime. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building sent a jolt through me. When I finally drifted off in the early hours, I dreamed of shadowy figures and locked doors that wouldn't stay shut. The next morning, I woke to find a note slipped under my door. My blood ran cold as I read the words scrawled in messy handwriting. "You can't hide forever." Panic surged through me, and I called the police again, showing them the note. They took it as evidence but seemed skeptical. "It could just be a prank," one officer said, though his tone wasn't convincing. For the next few days, I barely left my apartment. I even worked from home, too afraid to walk the streets of Los Santos. But the men didn't stop. One evening, I spotted the scar-faced man leaning against a lamppost across the street, his eyes fixed on my window. He didn't move, didn't try to hide. He just stood there, a silent reminder that they knew where I lived. Desperation forced me to take action. I borrowed a friend's car and drove to a nearby motel, paying in cash to avoid leaving a trail. For 2 days, I stayed there, jumping at every sound and checking the locks repeatedly. On the 3rd day, I got a call from the police. They had caught the men. They were attempting to break into an apartment on your street. The officer said, "We're holding them on suspicion of burglary, but based on your report, we'll be adding harassment charges as well." Relief washed over me as I hung up the phone. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I returned to my apartment, but things weren't the same. I installed extra locks on my doors and avoided walking alone at night. Los Santos had always been a city full of life and opportunity, but now its shadows felt darker, its streets more menacing. I still think about those men sometimes, how close they came to me, how they followed me, knowing I had no way of stopping them. But I survived, and I learned never to ignore the feeling of being watched. The morning air was heavy with a humid stillness as I pulled my daughter's hand to cross the street. We were heading toward a little antique shop I'd seen tucked away in the quieter corner of Grove Street. I don't even know why I suggested going in. It wasn't like we needed anything, but it was one of those days when boredom drove you to strange places. As we stepped into the shop, it felt like the world outside had been left behind. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust, and the wooden floor creaked with every step. Shelves reached high, crammed with peculiar items, old picture frames, faded vinyl records, tarnished jewelry, and more dolls than I'd ever seen in one place. My daughter wandered ahead, her small sneakers squeaking as she darted between shelves. "Look at this," she called out, pointing to a collection of music boxes. I smiled, pretending to admire them, but something about this shop unsettled me. That's when she saw it. On the farthest shelf, partially hidden behind an ornate lamp, sat a porcelain doll. It wore a pale green dress, its delicate face painted with large brown eyes and lips curled into a faint smile. My daughter's face lit up as though she'd found buried treasure. "Can we get her? Please?" she asked, holding the doll close. I hesitated. There was something odd about the doll, something I couldn't put into words. Its gaze seemed too deliberate, too knowing, but my daughter's excitement won me over. The shopkeeper, an older woman with a wiry frame and hair tied in a tight bun, eyed us as we approached the counter. "You've chosen Hazel," she said, her tone almost a whisper. "Hazel?" I asked, confused. "That's her name," the woman replied. "She's been here a long time." She paused, leaning forward slightly. "Be careful with her." I laughed nervously, brushing off the warning as part of the shop's spooky aesthetic. We brought Hazel home, and my daughter wasted no time making her a part of the family. Hazel sat on her bedside table that night, her green dress gleaming softly in the dim light. It started small. The next morning, my daughter told me Hazel had talked to her in a dream. I figured it was just her imagination. Kids dream about all sorts of things. But as the days passed, her attachment to the doll grew. Obsessive. She started talking to Hazel when she thought I wasn't listening. Not just in passing, full conversations. "What do you think I should wear today, Hazel? You're so funny." She even started setting a place for the doll at the dinner table. One night, I heard her whispering in her room long after bedtime. I opened the door and found her sitting on the floor, Hazel propped up in front of her. My daughter's head whipped around as I entered, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite identify. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "She doesn't like it when you interrupt." She replied flatly. "Who doesn't like it?" "Hazel." I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. "Okay. Well, Hazel and you need to get some sleep. It's late." Her gaze lingered on me for a moment before she nodded and climbed into bed. As I tucked her in, I caught a glimpse of Hazel sitting on the bedside table. For a split second, I thought her head had turned slightly to face me. I shook it off as my imagination. The next day, things took a darker turn. My daughter was quiet during breakfast, barely touching her food. When I asked her what was wrong, she said Hazel didn't want her to eat because it's not time yet. Not time for what? I asked. She won't tell me, she said, her voice tinged with frustration. That night, I woke up to a strange noise coming from her room. It was a faint crackling sound, followed by the unmistakable smell of smoke. I bolted out of bed, my heart racing. When I opened her door, I was greeted by chaos. The curtains were on fire, flames licking the ceiling. My daughter stood in the middle of the room, clutching Hazel. She wasn't crying or panicking. She just stood there, staring at the fire as if it were a movie. I screamed her name, pulling her out of the room and into the hallway. The fire alarm blared as I grabbed a fire extinguisher and doused the flames. The fire was out within minutes, but her room was a charred mess. "What happened?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "She told me to do it," my daughter said, her voice eerily calm. "Hazel said the fire would make everything better." I didn't know what to say. My hands trembled as I stared at her. The doll was still in her arms, its porcelain face untouched by the fire. That was the final straw. I grabbed Hazel and threw her into the trash bin outside, ignoring my daughter's screams of protest. She cried herself to sleep that night, begging me to bring Hazel back. The days that followed were difficult. My daughter became withdrawn, refusing to talk to me or play with her friends. I sought help from a child therapist, desperate to understand what was happening. Through weeks of therapy, she slowly opened up. She spoke about how Hazel had started as a friend, but soon became controlling, whispering things into her ear, telling her what to do. She said Hazel told her the fire would make her part of the family. The therapist worked with her to process the experience, helping her separate reality from imagination. It was a long road, but eventually my daughter began to recover. The light returned to her eyes, and the nightmares stopped. I never told her, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the doll in the trash. Something about it felt too dangerous. Instead, I took it far from Los Santos, to an abandoned lot on the outskirts of Blaine County, and buried it deep in the dirt. To this day, I don't know if Hazel was just a doll or something far worse, but every time I see my daughter's smile, I remind myself of one thing: she's safe now, and that's all that matters.